Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Sharman. I am a curator at the Art Gallery of Alberta. Very happy to be welcoming Adrian Simpson and our friends from MacEwan University. Tonight we're having a both in-person and online event, and we have about 50 people sort of joining us online. So the AGA is situated on Treaty 6 territory, and Edmonton is traditional land of diverse Indigenous people, including the Cree, Blackfeet, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe. I would also like to acknowledge all of the Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people who make their homes on territories that intersect the current borders of Alberta. Me and my ancestors have a long and varied relationship with this land. The first of my ancestors to arrive on Treaty 6 was my great-great-grandmother, who arrived here in Edmonton shortly after the signing of Treaty 6. She came here with her family, including my great-grandmother, who I did have the opportunity to know. And they settled actually just a couple of blocks away from where I live now in Edmonton. Inspired by this exhibition, Inheritance, that features Adrian Simpson and grapples with our shared history, I have also done some uncomfortable digging into my own family tree and learned that my great-grandfather, on a separate branch of the family tree, who came from England, taught in an Anglican day school on Treaty 6 for 4 years in the late 1930s. Treaty 6 is also where I was first introduced to Adrian's work, and when we were both studying at the University of Saskatchewan. Adrian has one of three major installations in the exhibition Inheritance, which is up here at the AGA on the 3rd floor and is up until May 1st. This exhibition forefronts historical facts that are often hidden or untold because they reveal that our shared past includes and is often based on acts and systems of brutality, racism, and oppression. Told by artists through research into the lives of family members and familial connections, the works in Inheritance demonstrate that history continues to reverberate through time, impacting the present and the future. Deanna Bowen, Stephen Ninoda, and Adrian Stimson, respectively, expose shared histories of anti-Black racism and the KKK in Alberta, the internment of Canadians of Japanese descent during the Second World War, and the Indian residential school system. So this evening, Adrian is joining us here at the AGA, and tomorrow he's going to be spending some time at MacEwan University with the students over there. And we're very happy to have worked with our friends and colleagues at MacEwan to be able to bring Adrian to Edmonton. So tonight, as I said, our program is online and in person. All of our online programs are brought to you by the Canada Council. So thank you, Canada Council. So Adrian is going to speak for about 45 minutes, after which I'll facilitate some questions. And then the gallery is also open this evening. So we will try to get everyone enough time to be able to head up to the show on the 3rd floor after the talk. So I would like to invite Carrie Lynn Reeves, who is assistant professor in studio arts at MacEwan University, and Nevin Jarvis, who is a student at MacEwan, to come up and introduce Adrian for us.
So thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to the AGA. I'm Carrie Lynn Reeves, assistant professor at MacEwan University in the Studio Arts program, soon to be the Studio Arts department of our new BFA. And I'm really happy to be here with Adrian tonight. I've known Adrian for just over a decade, first met him at an art residency in Banff, and we've crossed paths over the years and over the territories. So it's nice to be here tonight. And I'd like to introduce our student, Nevin Jarvis, who's a first-year student in studio arts, to introduce Adrian.
Adrian Simpson is a member of the Siksika Blackfoot Nation in Southern Alberta. Adrian has a BFA with distinction from the Alberta College of Art and Design and MFA from the University of Saskatchewan. He's an interdisciplinary artist and exhibits nationally and internationally. His performance art looks at identity construction, specifically the hybridization of the Indian, the cowboy, the shaman, and the two-spirit being. Buffalo Boy and the shaman exterminator are two reoccurring personas. His paintings are varied, yet his use of black and white monochromatic paintings that depict Bison in imagined landscapes are melancholic, memorializing, whimsical. They evoke ideas of cultural fragility, resilience, and nostalgia. His installation work primarily examines the residential school experience. He has used the material culture from Old Sun Residential School on his nation to create works that speak to genocide, loss, and resilience. He was a participant in the Canadian Forces Artist Program, which sent him to Afghanistan. Adrian was awarded the Governor General Award for Visual and Media Arts in 2018, Reveal Indigenous Arts Award, Petition Foundation 2017. He was awarded the Blackfoot Visual Arts Award in 2009, the Alberta Centennial Medal in 2005, and the Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal in 2003. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you, Nevin, for that lovely introduction. So great to have a student come in and introduce me. So thank you, Carrie Lynn, for arranging that, and MacEwan University for being a part of this. Also like to thank the Art Gallery Alberta, Catherine Croston, and Lindsay Sharman for including me in Inheritance and inviting me here today to speak to you all. To all of you in the room, thank you for coming out this evening to see you, and or partially, so we're still in the middle of it sometimes, or sometimes right now. And to all of you out in the dark, good to see you, not see you. Thank you for being here tonight. So here I go. I'm going to do a PowerPoint of my work and speak primarily to Inheritance and the work I have in the exhibition. But I thought I'd start kind of at the beginning. And this is Natusapi, Chief Olson. He is my great-great-great-grandfather. Because we're an oral culture, record keeping not being a big part of that, determining the actual lineage to Chief Olson is a little bit of a task, but I am part of this clan and is his grandson. And he had a number of wives in his life, and we're still trying to determine which lineage I come from. But nonetheless, he is my grandson. He was one of the chiefs at the time of signing Treaty 7 on Siksika. He was known as, he was a warrior, a fierce warrior. And I've been reading a bit of his history and sort of looking at it sometimes with a little bit of a, oh my goodness, his war exploits were a little brutal at times. And so, you know, looking back at my own history and seeing that, but he was very svelte apparently and very athletic. In those days, I imagine a good catch. So anyway, that was my great-grand Chief Olson. He was the leader of North Camp, which is where my family is located on the Siksika Nation. And he was reluctant to sign Treaty 7 because of his warrior past. He often preferred war to peace. And it took the council at that time to convince him. And he became one of the signatures of Treaty 7 and laid down the weapons of war for the weapons of peace, and something we could all use in these days. So that's where we'll start today in terms of inheritance. So in fact, I have inherited his history, and a lot of it has ended up in my work. Here's another image of Chief Olson, and interestingly enough, his garb, what he's wearing right now, and in the previous image as well, the plumage on his hat. There are stories about that because it relates to the work that's upstairs, and A.A. Bronson, who was the grandchild of Reverend Timms, who was the first Anglican missionary on the Siksika Nation. And it was the Reverend Timms' wife who apparently dressed Olson this way. So interesting connections when you start sort of looking at history and in the eyes of today and the connections we have today. So there's a number of things that have occurred that I find very interesting. Chief Olson, the first Anglican missionaries to Siksika Nation, first only had this monstrosity residential school was built in the early 1900s. and of course the red brick institutional sort of building. This is the building, and it still exists on my nation. It has since transitioned in the 70s to a community college, so now infused with a different energy through time. Yet it still holds that energy of the past. My father, his sisters, all my relations on the west side of the nation went to this school. My reserve was divided in two, and the east went to the Catholics and the west went to the Anglicans. And the North Camp happened to be in the west, so my family all became Anglicans. And which is always an interesting sort of dichotomy in the sense of one people, two different religions, overriding on top our own religion. So it's an interesting sort of conundrum when you think about it. For this presentation, I start to look back and sort of think, when did I really start delving into my history in relation to residential schools? And it started in my undergrad at the now Alberta University of the Arts. And it was there that I determined to be a painter. I majored in painting. And that's when I first started painting. I was actually working on the Bison primarily. A lot of my work, people who are familiar with me are familiar with a lot of the Bison work that I do, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But I also sort of started delving into the residential school history. And these 4 paintings I'm going to show next are from a series I called Wake Up. They're 2 feet by 2 feet. And that's also when I started using white titanium oil paint mixed with graphite powder to create the different values and such. And so I went to the Paul Litterwalker Cemetery, which is situated behind the Olson Residential School, where the majority of my family is buried. And I started taking photographs. And I often go there to be with my ancestors and relations. It's an interesting site in many ways. And so from those images, I did these paintings, and then I whitewashed them. I dripped white paint all the way down the top to sort of hide them and veil them somewhat. And then that's the first time that I really drew the red line. And the red line shows up a lot in my work. And really the red line for me, this series is called Wake Up. Wake Up, of course, being, wake up from the colonial project, everyone. And also the sort of history of wakes. I think in that ritual that occurs when people gather to celebrate and mourn their loss. So for me, it's one of the things living on my First Nation, and I can probably say a lot of First Nations, that death is close. Death is a constant companion. Sadly, the trauma throughout time has taken its toll. And there have been, moments where, there's a funeral a week. Last year, we had over 100 members die. You can imagine in a small community how much of an impact that is. And really is part of our story and part of the history of colonialism and its effects. So for me, the idea of wake up has that double meaning in the sense of mourning, but also in that sense of let's wake up and really look and examine the history of colonialism. And also too, when you look at the red line, it's drawing the line. And so don't cross the line. But also too, when you look at the flat line, it also relates to that. I'm always amazed at when other people come to me with their stories about what they see in the work, and it's always heartwarming and illuminating in so many ways. So there were a series of 9 in this particular work, and I know there's a few in collections in Calgary. But for me, really, a lot of the work sort of parallels the history of the slaughter of the bison, for which existed on the plains. I've always say 75 million, but I was corrected by a friend of mine, Dr. Ernie Walker, who works at Wanuskewin, and he said there's probably more like about 50 million. So millions, a few millions off, but I think that those are numbers that prove that the bison was a huge force in the Americas. And as we well know, that with the coming of the settlers, they needed to clear the plains, and so for which the bison were slaughtered, and almost to the point of extinction. And that slaughter was deliberate, and what it did, it really sort of set up the stage for, of course, colonization and taking over the land, but also the national dream, the national railway as well. So many sort of factors with that history. The bison meant everything to the Blackfoot people and any Plains tribe people who relied on the bison for everything: food, shelter, clothing, tools, you name it, and mostly spiritual life. The Blackfoot are highly aligned with the bison. One of our most sacred societies is the Motogeeks, and the Motogeeks are the Buffalo Women's Society. We are a matriarchal society, and they lead us. And they have very close connections to the bison, and that filters down to all the other societies: the Horns, the Brave Dogs, the Prairie Chickens, all the way down to the children, the Bumblebee societies. And so in my earlier work, I really looked at the idea of the slaughter from a sort of a physics perspective, that we're all made up of atoms and molecules. And when we die, that is released into the universe. And so I see that slaughter as that energy was released into the universe. And I believe that that energy still exists in and around us. And as an artist, I get the privilege and honor of being able to reach into that ether and bring that energy into myself and create work and honor the history of the bison. So I always say that every time I draw, act like, or anything to do with bison, I'm honoring one of those 50 million bison that were slaughtered. This particular work was actually debuted at the Art Gallery of Grand Prairie a number of years ago. This was called Tartan Feathered Bison. And Tartan Feathered Bison sort of came from the movie Little Big Man. I don't know if everybody's seen that movie, but when Dustin Hoffman and the snake oil sort of medicine guy get caught and then they're tarred and feathered. Of course, the history of tarred and feathering goes back to England, when they used to pour hot vats of tar over the side of the building and set it on fire. But then further from that, used to tar people and feather them as a punishment. So in essence, this is a punishment, but also tar is a derivative of smoke. And I think that sometimes when you look at things like tobacco smoke and the sacredness of tobacco and stuff, so there's underlying things in the work. But this was from that exhibition, and it was called Tartan Feathered Bison. And the beautiful thing about that exhibition is they let me tar and feather a complete wall of the gallery. And that was something that, us artists get to do. And it kind of harkens back to being a kid. I get to do this. And anyway, so this is another work that was in that exhibition. It also goes back to earlier paintings I did, and this was an abstract painting I did of bones. And so I was doing a lot of work around bison bones. And this is about 5 feet by 4 feet. And really comes from the historical images from piles of bones in different locations across America, in Canada, Regina being one of the most noted, and Saskatoon, where they would have piles up to 2 stories high. Those bones were often shipped down east and ground into fertilizer or even explosives, interestingly enough, or shipped across overseas and turned into fine bone china. So fine bone china of that age may have bison remnants or bison DNA in them. So I find that very interesting as well. Again, the bison bones, and this is actually now part of the painting, one of the paintings that's upstairs of Old Sun. I decided to create triptychs with those works and sort of bring more to life the work itself. I also act like a bison from time to time, and my alter ego or persona is called Buffalo Boy. And Buffalo Boy was a character parody during my research while I was doing my master's at the University of Saskatchewan. I was looking at Buffalo Bill and his Wild West shows, the spectacle of it, the exclusion, the inclusion, the spectacle of Indigenous participation in those shows. Buffalo Bill himself, coming from a background of being an Indian hunter and a bison hunter, and then sort of turning around at some point to become for First Nations, but a colorful character nonetheless. And so while I was sitting in my studio on the coldest day of the year, that year was -60, and basically I was thinking, Buffalo Bill, Buffalo Bill, Buffalo Boy. And that's when Buffalo Boy was born. And basically with the tenets of the disco cowboy hat, the braids, the buckskin jacket with the fringe, the bison corset, the bison G-string, fishnet stockings, cowboy boots, and pearls. Also a whip. And because Buffalo Boy likes to exercise the colonial project, talk back to the colonial project. He's naughty and has done a number of performances in his life. He has been killed on a few occasions, but he's always come back. And then he went and dreamt about 4 or 5 years ago and is still dreaming. And actually next weekend, Buffalo Boy, newborn Buffalo Boy, comes to be again as an older, maybe wiser Buffalo Boy, but still the tenets of Buffalo Boy. And so that's happening at the Remy Modern next week and Friday night. So anyway, Buffalo Boy is still around with us, and we'll see what antics they get up to in the next little while. Buffalo Boy often uses humor as a part of looking at the colonial project. Humor being a coping mechanism, humor being a way to open up spaces for people to talk. And so I often sort of looked at the archive. Particular image comes from the first Indian residential or Indian school, mission school, sorry, on Siksika. And in the back there, I don't know if you can see here, I'll use my cursor and make a little circle around. The Reverend Timms. There's the Reverend Timms again. He shows up in a lot of the images. And I could be related to a number of these individuals in this photograph. But I was looking at this photograph and I thought, well, how could Buffalo Boy respond to this? And so I did it myself. I did a parody of that image. And in this one, I actually solved the puzzle in the background because it hasn't been solved. But the funny thing is I solved it wrong. So I was told that by a viewer of my work one day. He said, do you know that formula, that's wrong? I said, oh no. And I said, actually, that makes sense. It's good, it's wrong. And my settler grandmother, her china cabinet is called Sketches of Indian Life. And if you look through that book, it was written by a missionary, and it has titles such as The Good Indian, The Bad Indian, The Really Bad Indian. No, I added that. And so it was also in itself, you look at how literature forms our understanding of people and creates the biases that we live with today. So I think for me, that was that sort of moment of like, oh. This is the first Anglican boys choir or in the school. And again, the Reverend Timms is sort of halfway in the back with the beard, white beard. He's there again. And so this was the first mission school. And there's Buffalo Boy, onward, upward. I often include so the history of religion and as being complicit in the colonial project, and particularly complicit in the residential day schools. Again, I'm just showing you some earlier work previous to this, so you see context of how everything sort of fits together. This was one of the first works I created during my master's at U of S, and this is called Sick and Tired. As a younger person back home, my mom worked at the Olson College, and one year went through some major renovations, and all that stuff was just taken out and thrown in the back dump. So I used to get off the bus and sort of, because we now live in the Olson Residential School garden, which is down the hill in the valley, in the Bow Valley from where the school is. So I'd get off the bus and I would walk home. I'd always walk by the dump and I'd see all this stuff. And it could be the hoarder in me. I don't know what it is, or at that time I didn't think I was an artist. And I would drag this stuff home and put it into my mom's garage and just say, oh, I'm going to use it someday for something. And that's where it all sat for many, many years until I started doing my studies for my BFA and my MFA. And so this one are 3 of the windows from Olson Residential School and the bed from that school. I have backfilled with feathers and backlit, and then put a human sort of effigy on the bed and lit it from above to look like, I didn't put the mattress on because I deliberately wanted the springs to look like a stretched hide. And this is sort of things I think about my father, who went to that school and about 7 years old was showering in the boys' side one day and missed his family so much that he decided to run away. And at 7 years old, ran on camp to where my grandparents were naked, and only to be brought back. And that's an image that sticks with me and my father. And I imagine a lot of those kids looking out those windows, longing to be home, and that sense of smothering. So therein lies the feathers. Ulsan is another installation I did, and this is actually the previous is in the collection of the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina. This is in the collection of Ontario again. This one is Ulsan because the light came from Ulsan. It was the light that hung above the children and artificial light. And so that is part of the installation, and a facsimile of a sweat lodge, except the willow reeds are replaced by steel ribs, steel, sort of that relationship to resource extraction and also the national dream, the railway. And it sits above, pieced together bison robes. And the way the light shines through the ribs is the shadow of the Union Jack, which is a shadow that sort of haunts the history of all of us. And actually, just a little note on this particular installation they did at the AGO, it was hung in, or it was placed in the middle of the room with all the group of sevens and some other artists, Sunny Asu and a few other people. And the painter in me was absolutely delighted because I actually love Lauren Harris and all these painters in so many ways, even though I know there's history of problematics in terms of the absence of indigeneity and such in the paintings. But from a purely painting perspective, I was quite delighted that my work was amongst them. It's one of those surreal moments as an artist as you move through your career, is that there are moments that happen that you kind of shake your head and go, what's going on here? And that was one of those moments, delightfully. I have quite the archive of images from Ulsan Residential School. And this is just some of the photographs that are now in the exhibition upstairs. These are the Ulsan boys. Here's a picture of my father at that time. He was part of those images, a young fellow who from Ulsan, probably at about 15 or so, they went down to St. Paul's on the Kainai First Nation in southern Alberta and did a work there. And then he started actually working in the schools, first as a mechanic and in the boiler room. And then suddenly at that time, because it was those times and First Nations people could barely get any work, he trained as a barber, but then started to follow the administrator of one of these residential schools, and he started working in them. So a complicated history. At the time too was when the schools were being released from the churches into the government. So a change of policy was occurring, and I know he for allowing children to go home and changing the system in itself. Later years, I would ask him, we had a few sessions of unpacking the history and sort of asked him, well, given the history in your experience, why did you work in the schools? And really it was happenstance. It was the times, work, the way people thought at the time too. So it was interesting to have that chat. As you can see, this is a postcard from Ulsan, a Christmas card, in fact. And I've always thought this was just the most ironic and actually kind of tragic postcard for Christmas, because the parable or whatever, suffer little children. And if we look at it in the context of today, it kind of makes you head spin. A piece I did was called Aggressive Assimilation. And this is me when I first started attending residential day school in the Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan. And my father, when he was about to leave residential school, and we flank the Ulsan Residential School, which kind of where it started all for my family, and sort of speaking to that intergenerational history and traumas that get handed down from generation to generation, but in fact, the traumas in themselves are inflicted within those generations as well. The next number of images is just part of that archive from Ulsan. During a sports day. These ones are interesting because a lot of them have movie cameras in them. So obviously they were documenting Ulsan at one point, but I have not been able to find any of this anywhere yet. So anybody out there who may know where these films exist, and I'm thinking the National Film Board or something, I don't know. But really, again, if you take a look at this, the staging of the children, and really quite, eye-opening. And again, the boys' dorm, the beds that they were sleeping in. The agricultural sort of working camps that they used to have. A lot of, in particular, people on my nation ended up in ranching. But again, we excelled at it in so many ways. When we take on the Western sort of labor and jobs, we excelled at it. And so much so that the Indian agents were getting a lot of complaints from local farmers. So sadly, they sabotaged us. So now we have few farmers on our nation, sadly. But a really big history of it. I know my own grandparents were into farming for a while. So one of the things I've done too is paintings. These are smaller paintings, about 8 inches. And these are just the architecture of all the residential schools that relate to my history and my family, starting with Ulsan. The bottom 2 lines, black and red, are traditional Blackfoot colors that are often used on bottom of teepees. And I love painting skies and stormy skies, and it's one of the things I enjoy. I'm also interested in the architecture of these buildings, most of which are being destroyed. And there's been an interesting debate about should they be destroyed or not. I'm of the opinion that as hard as it is, there should be some that remain. I think they should remain, quite simply because if we get rid of them all, we forget this history. And I think it's really important to maintain some of them in order to sort of not forget this history. But I do know that there are a number of people who love to see this building burnt down and love to see it demolished. But at the same time, it also has this new history as being a college on my First Nation. Here is St. Paul's in Kainai First Nation, Southern Alberta. Here is, I'm losing my mind, in Sault Ste. Marie. I can't remember. This is the first time I've done an actually in-person talk in the last little while. Shinwak, there it comes. I do have brain cells left. And Shinwak was actually the residential school where my parents met and where I was conceived. So my history is very intimate with these schools. And then not even a month after I was born, we went up to James Bay to, at the time, a place called Fort George. It's now known as Chisisipi. And this is the first Indian residential school up there. It was a wood building, but since it's been replaced by a brick building. But I thought the wood building was much more interesting. So this is St. Philip's. And then we moved to Gordon's First Nation in Saskatchewan, and that's when I first started attending day school. I went from nursery right through to about grade 3, and then we moved to Lebret, and that's where I finished off grade 4 at Lebret Indian Residential Day School. Again, these paintings, this one's upstairs in the exhibition. This is Ulsan, flanked by the bones, again with Ulsan in the back, a little bit more dramatic in the sense of the bones in the forefront, and some of the images that you may have seen earlier, and the bison, of course, is being a big part of that history, be it a ghost or the white bison, that maybe it's about hope. That's the thing I think I enjoy about painting, is that I often have an idea about what the painting means, but it often, I think, is so important that the viewer bring their own history and their own thoughts to it. And I'm often amazed by what other people see. Again, St. Paul's and the Kainai First Nation, named after St. Paul. One of the things I think that's interesting about being an artist and creating work is that your work is not static, it's dynamic, and it moves through time. And as it moves through time, different meanings and different things come forward. And in particular, this one, I think of our current situation of the finding of the graves of the children. And I think about the crosses in relation to those schools. This was Shinwak, and I guess the sort of the beginning of my beginnings, and situated at the juncture of the Great Lakes. And as Morley Turkoff, the writer, said many years ago, a good place to come from. And then St. Philip's in Fort George. And that's me as a child with a lovely pose and a red hat. And that's actually the building that now exists. And in the background, the planes are coming in from the south. The panther on the roof is an interesting one, because my father had a pink snowmobile, and on the pink snowmobile was a black panther. So he called his snowmobile the Black Panther. And so I included that, and then of course the caribou and the geese, and and the fire, which a lot of people gather around, and also the narwhals and the whales. The two pieces, shadows, are actually of Inuit sculpture of two bears, polar bears. And as a child, I did, different than today, my parents would buy these things and then I would play with them. So I would play with these little stone sculptures, and through time, and we still have these two in my home. And I think for me, I think it's like where I first sort of got my hands on art and started to sort of imagine myself creating these things in themselves. So I thank the Inuit and the Northern Cree for that. This is Gordon's residential school, Indian residential school. And this is, and I think for those who are out there and for those who are here, there are a few things I will say that may be triggering, and I hope that you have resources to help. But this is actually where a lot of my abuse occurred in this institution. And one of the things that in terms of giving a signifier, are the two gophers in the cage. At one point when I was being molested in this particular room, they caught gophers and they would put them in these cages, and they sort of ran around these cages. So I'd look over and see these little caged gophers. And it's a memory. It's funny what stays with you when abuse occurs. And this is a memory that has always remained with me. And perhaps now why I have a very interesting relations with gophers. We have a lot of gophers around my home. And during the pandemic, I learned how to speak gopher. I learned their language. Learned their habits. It was so interesting. They're the most incredible little creatures and have an amazing relationship to bison. There's so many things that we know are part of the things that we need to bring back and help sort of create a more interesting and magical world. And so for me, the caged gopher in many ways at that time sort of signaled my own self within those institutions. And of course, the hands on the wall and coming down, it's that sense of surrender, or that sense of arrest. And then Lebret was the last school that I was. And I think this is a story I often tell people, is that I don't actually paint Buffalo Boy in anything. And this is actually the first painting that I ever painted Buffalo Boy in. And it was at Lebret, and that was the last residential school we were at. And it was interesting because I think as a result of the abuse, and I haven't had any real psychological sort of analyzing of this, but my personality split at that age. And I became Adrian and Adrienne. And when Adrian would leave the school and go over to where my parents were, he would change into Adrienne, and the signifier their fringe jacket. And Adrienne would go outside and sort of play with everybody as a girl. And it was interesting because I often think that's where Buffalo Boy sort of began, that resilience, that resistance, that sort of coping with that history. And because Buffalo Boy today wears fringe jackets and such, and carries a whip and all that sort of stuff, but also the onslaught of bison that start to hide the school itself, and then the two side panels being the bison sort of flying around, and then the breaking up of the line. I'm going to get now into the apology, the work that's currently Ini Sakumapi, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And it really began when our artist, A.A. Bronson, who is a part of General Idea for many years, reached out to me. And he is the great-great-grandson of the Reverend Timms. And he has known his familial history, a bit of it, but he didn't really know a lot in relation to Siksika and the Blackfoot. And so he asked curator Candace Hawkins if she knew any Blackfoot people that he could connect to, and lo and behold, being another artist, she connected him with me. And we got to talking, and we all of a sudden found out that it was our grandfathers who were rivals. And Chief Olson didn't really like the Reverend Timms. It was like a frenemy. And it was so funny because one of the stories is that he didn't like him. He only gave him, I think, 8 square meters by 8 square meters of land that he could be on, because he knew he was going to take it. I just recently read that story and thought it was kind of funny. But A.A. Bronson, and I won't tell his story, but he reached out to me and asked about the possibility of giving an apology to the Siksika Nation. You know, his own familial history, the trauma that occurred there, you know, translated to now to a time when he wanted to you know, reach out. And so what he did is, I think that, you know, he approached it in a good way, in the sense that he came to us and asked us if he could make an apology first. So what I did is I started to facilitate it, and I gathered residential leaders and invited him down to the First Nation to have a dinner where we could discuss an apology. And so, you know, being the artists that we are, I dressed up as Buffalo Boy. And so we had the dinner at my place, and I served my Buffalo Boy's famous buffalo meat pies, and really had a very frank, emotional, and important discussion about the apology he proposed. And it was a lovely evening of discussion and fellowship, and the beginning of our friendship. And so that was just an image from the Toronto. Basically, what we asked was that the elders agreed, and we took it to our chief and council, and they gave us the blessing to go receive the apology in Toronto at the Biennale, with the caveat that AA come back to the nation at some point and deliver it to the people during one of our celebrations. As we well know, COVID stepped in and sort of stopped everything, and it's something that's still intended to do. Yet at the same time, time is moving on. So this is at the Glenbow Archives, where we're looking at a number of Reverend Tim's artifacts and history. Ben Miller, who did the essay in A Public Apology to the Siksika Nation. Some more information there. Interesting enough, the Reverend Tim's collected a number, or either collected or given a number of Blackfoot artifacts that he then loaned to the Marquis of Lorne. And the Marquis of Lorne stole it and took it to England and sold it to the British Museum for like $100 back then. I had the privilege of going to the British Museum a few years back to actually look at that, all in the British Museum, which was quite interesting to see it there. Earlier image of A.A. Bronson. I think people are aware of the history of General Idea and the AIDS poster they have done. Here's the Reverend Tim's photograph of him and his wife and family. Here are some images. Also, too, if you have the opportunity to watch the documentary In the Making, I did an episode. They did episodes on various artists, and they did an episode on myself. And it just so happened that it coincided with all this meeting with A.A. Bronson. So we felt it was an to give. And there is Buffalo Boy in the kitchen making food. There's Sean and Ben and Gregory Big Eye, one of the elders. And this is during the dinner when we were speaking. Letitia Red Crow and Romeo Crow Chief and Myrna Youngman were also part of that dinner. And it was really during that dinner, and as I mentioned, there was a number of emotional moments, but when AA mentioned genocide, and we spoke to that history, as well as to my husband, Happy Grove is in the photos as well. So basically from that, I also, the work I called Inisakumapi, which is Blackfoot for Buffalo Boys, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And I think most of you may be aware of the earlier movies with Sidney Poitier, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, about the history of race relations. And I think it was something that I often refer to either movies or music in a lot of the work I do, because it has not only a nostalgic, but often has a relational sort of element to the work I do. And so in doing this, AA and I talked, and I'm just going to do a response to the apology. And so all the work I did in the exhibition above is upstairs is related to the response. So again, the bison is something element occurs. These are little bronze bison, and there's a setting of 10 on the plates, and I put them on the plates, sort of looking at the diner, in a way interrogating the diner, But I often work with 10 as well, because as we well know, the childish song, 10 Little Indians, and that song, again, that indoctrination into killing off each Indian as you go along. So it's well embedded in the Canadian psyche in our histories. So a great thing to overcome. AA produced the apology, but along with all the research that he did and timeline of Reverend Timms and up to today and our meeting. And I can't remember exactly, I think 20,000 copies of these, and they were given out at the Biennale. They still exist upstairs, and I think people can take them away. But also, when I presented this to our chief of council, it was really interesting at the time that they were looking at some of the information and said, oh, this information could help us in some ways, like the research. And that's so important, is that research is so important and how it sort of can assist. It is. Here's the Toronto Biennale, AA's installation there, which was with the pallets of books for people to take. Across from that was the work I did, and here's clearing the table, a painting I did of the girls' cafeteria at Old Sun Residential School. And it was interesting as I was painting this, I move between sort of realism and abstraction. I don't really know where to sit myself yet. And for me, as I was drawing this, and I have an elder who comes in my studio, and I often ask her, sometimes what she thinks. And there was a point when I was thinking I had to refine the faces a lot more. And she said, no, you're done. So it was interesting. The importance of feedback, as from an artist's perspective, sometimes really helps in a process. But again, that sense of those places. And it hangs again over with another light from Old Sun Residential School. Above the table, fine china, and the table itself, under the finery, is old replica of one of the tables that would have been in Old Sun. And it was built by a former Old Sun Residential School student, Gordon Littlelight. I asked him if he'd be willing to build that, and he did for me, which was really wonderful. Roses with the one red rose, the white roses with the red roses, the element that in the installation that needs often care and attention. But again, that sense of assimilation and at the same time, beauty. So I work a lot with pictographs, and there are a number of pictographs that I created into sculptures. And this was, I could not really find a pictograph of Old Sun. And so I decided to create one. It's one of the honors I have now. I've been working with pictographs and looking at the similarities through time, but also the differences, and what pictographs sort of hold as a single symbol is so interesting. And so I'm doing that right now and embarking on another project where I'll deeply go into the Blackfoot pictographic system, or language, I should say. Our Fathers, these again from the archive that I have. And as I was looking at these boys, these Old Sun School boys, from about 1955, 56, my father included, I couldn't help but sort of think, now these are our dads, these are our fathers now. And so that's where the title came, Our Fathers. Sorry, I don't have a really good image of the Reverend Timms or short robes. We have a Blackfoot pictograph of the first Anglican missionaries, and I might have it someplace down the road. Or you can see it upstairs. So I forget, it's right here in the building. And it is a short robes, the first Anglican missionary. So I say it's Reverend Timms. I created a book of the Old Sun boys in conjunction with A.A. Bronson. And it has all the photographs of the boys and their names alongside. I deliberately didn't put the names beside or part of the installation upstairs for a number of reasons. Installation itself, this was taken, I believe, at the Remy Modern, which is that now it's part of their collection. It's one of the things that I have to say about institutions and art galleries that become the repository of artists' work, that they're in there for safekeeping, and I'm so grateful for that. So thank you to all organizations who collect my work. Another image from the table. I'm going to start flying through these images. Another installation. This one, pictograph, actually exists too. What actually happened is that the Reverend Timms, his piety and not allowing the children to go back home because of fear of them turning back into heathens, a number of children were sick and he wouldn't allow them to go home to die. So you can imagine the anger that that created within the parents. And the parents decided that they were going to kill the Reverend Timms. So the Reverend Timms was warned, and he fled, I believe, to Tsuut'ina or Sarsi at the time, and burnt the school down and burnt his residence down. It was our first rebellion of sorts. And actually, it's interesting that even in his journals, that time is ripped out or taken apart, or not in there. And so this history is not known. And it's one of the things that was revealed as part of the A's research, which I think is so interesting. And it is part of our oral history. We know that there was a conflict, and we know the school was burnt down, but the details, of course, are lost in time. And in Alley in Toronto, when AA delivered the apology, and I brought a delegation with blessing of our chief and council at the time to receive the apology and to take it back again, indicating that it would be followed up with. I won't go too much into these because it's upstairs. But thank you again to Catherine and to Lindsay for including me in this exhibition. I'm very honored to be a part of it. A hard history, but an important one. And in part of this installation, I included 3 new works called Forgiveaway. An apology asks the question, will you forgive? And that's an interesting question, because I think reconciliations really has a lot to do with that. And, there's a lot of things that in history that are unforgivable. But, it's important in our time to learn to get along, to learn to create a society that's much. And I think, part of that is ingrained within Indigenous ways of the giveaway, the potlatch, many of our customs where we give everything away. And so for me, I created these images and then created little takeaways in sort of the traditions of Gonzalez Torres and other artists that have things for people to take away. And so in front of each one of them is a replica of the painting, and it's about giving away. And so these ones are basically based on, again, pictographs. And I often work in the sense of past, present, future. And so this is the past, which is sort of looking at the little sort of horned character, which is the bison, and also inspired by Waniscawen and the discovery of their and the split hoof tradition from the past, of where little effigies were scraped into rock, but also the cracks in the rocks were also the mysterious place, what we like to call the great mystery, that in those cracks perhaps was whole other worlds. And so this is the past. This is the present. So again, that sort of tension between sort of the history of indigeneity and settler history. And again, the crack, and this is gold leafed. And then the past, or the future, sorry. The future is like the past. I often see things that way. For the Blackfoot people, notions of time are interesting, and it's something I'm still working through to understand. But we only have 2 days behind us and 2 days ahead of us. That's the past and that's the future. So really, when you think about it, everything is really present, and everything that's happened will happen again. Or if we learn, maybe not. So I think it's really something that I find very fascinating, and something that I look forward to delving into more as an artist. And that's where I'll end. So thank you for having me. And I hope I've enlightened a bit of the work that's upstairs, but also my relationship to my own history and my own inheritance. So thank you. Thank you for that.